Hello everyone, back to our latest Star Wars video. So we talked in yesterday's video about an interview that JJ Abrams, director of Star Wars Episode 9, has conducted with fastcompany.com, where they go over primarily about JJ's production company, Bad Robot. That's primarily the focus of this long and vast-ranging interview. But JJ does touch on Episode 9. He talks, and we talked about this in yesterday's video, of course. He talks about how he came to work on Episode 9 as its director after the original director, Colin Trevorrow, was fired by Kathleen Kennedy, and JJ came on board with just 2 years to sort the film out, and absolutely no story, no script, nothing planned out whatsoever. You've got to work from scratch on it within 2 years. And Abrams wanted us to know very clearly what the state of play was with this film when he came on board with it after Colin Trevorrow was fired by Kathleen Kennedy. I said I'd have a look through the interview first, because it is a very long and very vastly ranging interview going over a lot of different subjects. I said I'd look into it further, have a further read of it, see if there's anything that was relevant to Star Wars Episode 9 or Star Wars saga generally. There is a little bit more that I've got to fill you in on, where JJ also talks about Rian Johnson and The Last Jedi. So we'll go over that for you right now, just to say that the description does hold the link to fastcompany.com, so if you want to read all of this article for yourself, you can do at fastcompany.com by using the link in the description here at YouTube. Right, so let's roll down, and so this is where they ask about Colin Trevorrow. Fast Company, how did it feel when you were suddenly brought on to direct Episode 9 after Colin Trevorrow departed, aka was sacked, let go, if you like, by Kathleen Kennedy while the film was still in development? That's where JJ Abrams tells us all about how it happened, and also goes into the fact that he didn't have any story or any plan to work with. So let's pick it up from here. Fast Company asking him what were the time constraints. Abrams says because they had announced the release dates, which is going to be, of course, the end of this year, December 2019. Because they had announced the release dates and everything works backwards. Fast Company was rescheduled and usually fast. Abrams says to have no script and to have a release date and have to be essentially a 2-year window when you're saying to yourself you've got 2 years from a decision to do it to releasing it, and you have literally nothing. You don't have the story, you don't have the cast, you don't have the designers, the sets. There was a crew, and there were things that will be worked on for the version that proceeds now, the Colin Trevorrow version, but this was starting over, so we completely started over yet again on a production that Kathleen Kennedy is producing. And because this was such a mega job, I knew at the very least I needed a co-writer to work on this thing with me. But I didn't know who that co-writer would be. There was nothing, again, just re-emphasising no script, no story. So the first thing I did was reach out to a writer who I've admired for years, Chris Terrio, who I didn't really know. And I said, listen, would you want to write Star Wars with me? And he screamed. That's where we left off with the interview on yesterday's video. So it is a little bit more. Fast Company asks, out of terror or out of excitement? Abrams replies, probably a bit of both. I think definitely excitement, and what I realised in that moment was I hadn't been aware until then that I needed to work with someone who would scream at prospect of working on Star Wars screaming excitement, because I had been through the process on The Force Awakens and I was looking at brass tacks. This is what it's going to be like, this is the reality of it, and he was looking at it sort of childlike. Oh my god, I can't believe we get to play in this world. What I needed to be reminded, which I need to be reminded of, I needed that point of view because that's not where I was. Of course, I was excited about what we could do, but I was acutely aware of how little time we had to do a fairly enormous job. Again, re-emphasising the mess that this thing was when he came on board with it. So it goes on a little bit more, quite a lot more actually, so you have to bear with me with this. So to answer your question, I went into it in an all-in leap of faith, aware that Katie, that's JJ Abrams' wife, was very supportive of this thing and felt it was the right thing. And so her divining rod of what's real and what's right was a comfort, despite her not being in London where most of the shooting of episode 9 took place. And it was just an immediate immersion into what ifs of it all, which is the fun of it, but also the pressure of it. And I'm not complaining when I say this, but it was having to make decisions based on gut. That's because there's nothing to work on at the point he comes on board. There's no story, there's no script, so he's got to produce the whole thing basically from a gut feeling of what would be best for this film. Then he goes on a little bit about Lost, which I don't think is particularly relevant. That is the TV show, of course, that JJ Abrams worked on. So let's move down a little bit and see if we can pick up from around there. So there wasn't time to get the studio notes that end up sometimes taking you in lateral positions and making you adjust to things, death by 1,000 cuts, to a place where something doesn't resemble what it should be and you can't remember why you got there or how. So I think that's, again, it's relating to his work on Lost, the TV show that he created, highly successful TV show back in the 1990s. So the good news was that I was jumping in with a writer whom I really admired enormously. That's Chris Terrio, of course, with Kathleen Kennedy, I think, and Callum Green, a producer whom I'd never met, Michelle Rujan, I'm not sure how to pronounce that, who had been my assistant and whom Kathy had hired to work with her as a producer. But it was a completely unknown scenario. This is where it starts getting quite interesting again. So it was a completely unknown scenario. I had some gut instincts about where the story should have gone. That's following The Force Awakens, of course. But without getting into the weeds of episode 8, that was a story that Rian wrote and was telling based on episode 7 before we met. So Rian was already creating his story for episode 8 before he knew anything about episode 7. I think that's what JJ is saying there, which seems very, very bizarre that Kathleen Kennedy, Lucasfilm, let him do that. So Rian basically had his idea for The Last Jedi for episode 8 before he'd ever met JJ Abrams or knew anything about JJ Abrams' Force Awakens, which does explain why there's barely any sort of connection between The Force Awakens and The Last Jedi. So, going on, JJ Abrams says, so he was taking the thing in another direction, of the sequel trilogy, of course. So, we also had to respond to episode 8, talking about episode 9, having to respond to episode 8. So our movie was not just following what we had started, it was following what we had started and then had been advanced by someone else. Rian Johnson. So there was that, and finally it was resolved in the 9 movies, while there are some threads of larger ideas and some big picture things that have been conceived decades ago, and a lot of ideas that Lawrence Kasdan and I had when we were doing episode 7, the lack of absolute inevitability, the lack of complete structure for this thing, the lack of complete structure, very important sentence for this thing, given the way it was being run, was an enormous challenge. So just to repeat that, so while there were some threads of larger ideas and some big pictures, some big picture things that have been conceived decades ago, and a lot of ideas that Lawrence Kasdan and I had when we were doing episode 7, the lack of absolute inevitability, So it hadn't been planned out to where it's going to end in this final film. The lack of complete structure for this thing, that's the sequel trilogy, no structure, no overall storyline, as we know. Given the way it was being run, presumably by Kathleen Kennedy overall, was an enormous challenge. So JJ Abrams is definitely putting it out there here, and in a lot of ways is telling us, again, what we know. There's no structure, there's no arc, there's no story that's sort of encompassing this sequel trilogy. There's a lack of structure. It's not being run in the way you'd expect it to be run for such a big project. That's making JJ Abrams' job on episode 9 an enormous challenge. He's also telling us that Rian Johnson took episode 8, The Last Jedi, in a direction that JJ Abrams wouldn't have taken it in, and Rian was creating The Last Jedi. I think he's saying he was creating it before really he'd ever met JJ Abrams, and before he knew pretty much what was actually going to be happening in The Force Awakens. So it's almost like Rian Johnson was creating a standalone film that just happened to have the title of Episode 8 and be a sort of a Star Wars saga film, which is very, very bizarre indeed. Just a final little bit more. JJ Abrams says, however, to answer your question truly finally, now that I'm back, the difference is I feel like we might have done it. Like, I actually feel like this crazy challenge that could have been a wildly uncomfortable contortion of ideas and a kind of shoving in answers and band-aids and bridges, band-aids, so fixing all the problems that we've got with this sequel trilogy, and particularly with The Last Jedi. And shoving in, so let's go over that again, a kind of shoving in of answers and band-aids and bridges and things that would have felt messy. Strangely, we were sort of relentless and almost invariably disciplined about the story and forcing ourselves to question and answer some fundamental films that at the beginning I absolutely had no clue how we would begin to address. Wonder whether that's related to Rey and to Luke Skywalker. Maybe. I feel like we've gotten to a place, without jinxing anything or sounding more confident than I deserve to be, I feel like we're in a place where we might have something incredibly special. So I feel relief being home, and I feel gratitude that I got to do it. And more than anything, I'm excited about what I think we might have with Star Wars Episode 9. And then the rest of the interview, which is a very, very long interview, but the rest of it is really going over Bad Robot, JJ Abrams' production company. So when we combine what JJ is telling us about the firing of Colin Trevorrow and the way JJ Abrams came on board with this project, and of course that's all down to Kathleen Kennedy, the fact that there was no plan, there was no story, there was no script, there's nothing for him to work with 2 years out from the release date for Episode 9. So that's Kathleen Kennedy's side of this. And also when he's telling us about what's going on with Rian Johnson creating The Last Jedi, and he's talking about band-aids and fixes, so he's acknowledging really that The Last Jedi and the sequel trilogy generally is very much a mess, really. It's not going quite that far to say that, but he's acknowledging that there are a lot of problems. If you're talking about band-aids, which are plasters that sort of fix things that have gone wrong, then obviously he's acknowledging there are a lot of problems with this project, and he's telling us that the way Rian Johnson created The Last Jedi was very, very strange indeed, given that it was supposed to be a sequel to his JJ Abrams' The Force Awakens, that they'd never even met when Rian was working on The Last Jedi. So he's basically telling us that The Last Jedi is kind of like a movie of its own, if you like. It just happens to be titled Star Wars Episode 8, but I don't think JJ Abrams has much idea of what Rian Johnson was supposed to be doing with The Last Jedi, certainly in terms of being a sequel to The Force Awakens and also being a bridge to Episode 9. I think by the sounds of it, JJ Abrams is rather bewildered by just exactly what Rian Johnson was doing with The Last Jedi and what Kathleen Kennedy was thinking of letting him do it. So putting it all together, if you combine what he's saying about JJ Abrams, what JJ Abrams saying about Rian Johnson, if you combine that what he's saying about Kathleen Kennedy, it does look like he's pushing both of them under the proverbial bus a little bit with this interview. Really, it's very interesting. It's a service just before Star Wars Celebration. Now, at the end, of course, JJ is saying that he thinks he's got something very special, but it's all going to work out. But I suppose we would say he would say that, wouldn't he? Because, I mean, he's not going to start talking down his movie months before it's going to be released. But he definitely wants to get this information out there. He wants us to know how difficult the circumstances were when he came on board with Star Wars Episode 9. And I think he's apprehensive, really. It sounds like there's bravado there, that they've probably got something that's very special. But reading between the lines and the fact that he's so sort of desperate to let us know how dire the circumstances were when he agreed to do Episode 9 2 years before the release date, it sounds to me like he's pretty apprehensive about how this whole thing is going to work out. And obviously he's not going to sort of talk down his movie at this point. He wants his movie to come out in December. Everybody go and see it. But, well, let me know what you think in the comments. I think he's sounding rather apprehensive when he's talking about how the circumstances of this film came around. I don't think, although there is that bravado about he thinks he's got something special, I don't think he's particularly confident that this sequel trilogy is ever going to form a coherent whole, a coherent narrative. So I think there's a lot of nervousness there, a lot of apprehensiveness there, and I think he wanted to get this out there and make it very much known that if this film sort of crashes and burns at the end of the year, the reason that that has happened is down to Kathleen Kennedy and to Rian Johnson. I think he's very, very keen that we know that, and he's putting his side of the story out there really, really early. I'm sure we'll hear more about the very bizarre way that this sequel trilogy has been created as we move further towards Episode 9. More people will start talking. There'll be interviews with other members of the cast and crew. And I'm sure we'll hear more about the very, very strange and bizarre way this film came about. I'm sure we'll see more of Kathleen Kennedy and probably particularly Rian Johnson being thrown under the bus as well in these interviews. And we shall see what transpires. Of course, we've got Star Wars Celebration coming up. I think it starts tomorrow, but the Episode 9 panel is going to be on Friday. Kathleen Kennedy is coming out of hiding. We haven't seen or heard anything of her for months and months and months. But she's coming out of hiding. She's going to be on the Episode 9 panel with JJ Abrams. Presumably there'll be other cast members there as well. And we'll see what they have to say. There's going to be a teaser trailer, we assume, and also the title reveal for the film. So we'll know more on Friday, and obviously I'll be doing more videos on Friday and into the weekend as well. But yeah, really interesting interview from JJ. I think he's trying to let us know in a not too subtle way that this whole thing really is something of a mess, and I think he wants us to know that quite clearly. Alright, if you enjoy the video, please like, share and subscribe, and we'll be back with more Star Wars content very, very soon. That's all for now though, and thanks for watching.